Good morning, everyone. We live in very extraordinary times. We are all working from home and are in lockdown and can't do the things that we would love to do or would like to do. One of the things that saddened me tremendously is the fact that Antoinette and I won't be able to support our eldest daughter and son-in-law with the birth of our first grandchild, seeing that we can't travel between provinces and to Johannesburg. It, however, does give me a great pleasure to welcome you all. We have quite a turnout. A particular warm welcome to our speakers, Graham Codrington, futurist. Graham, I suppose, although many businesses are suffering, yours must be booming. And also a warm welcome to the prolific academic and immunologist, Professor Johnny Peter. The program for the next 75 minutes or so is as follows. I will shortly hand over to Graham. Graham will share his thoughts on the world in South Africa after level 5 lockdown. That incidentally ends tonight. Life before universal vaccine and the world beyond COVID-19. He will endeavor to identify likely winners and look into emerging trends. He will speak for about 25 minutes and will then take questions for 10 to 15 minutes. We have already received quite a number of questions. However, feel free to send more through. Professor Johnny Peter is part of a team presently researching and trialing the potential protective impact of BCG. And I'm sure Johnny is going to tell us exactly how it works, because I understand all those born after 73 got it, but then ones over 60 like myself would also like to know whether we received it. And they're going to trial it amongst South African healthcare workers. BCG is the anti-TB vaccine, as I've said, and hopefully we will find out whether it either gives us protection or not. Prof. Johnny will talk for about 20 minutes and do likewise afterwards, answer questions. Without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Graham.
Thank you very much, Tace, and good morning or good afternoon from my side as well. It's great to be here, and thank you for taking the time to listen to what life after COVID would be like. And of course, as we think of what after COVID means, we need to realize that that isn't something that's going to just be a few years away, but we also need to be thinking about how we deal with life during COVID as well. So I've entitled my presentation, it's a little bit corny, I suppose, but I've entitled it ACDC, and that is after COVID, during COVID. So if we are thinking about life after or during COVID, obviously here in South Africa, as in many other parts of the world, we are looking at a lockdown situation. And the question is, what's going to happen in the next few weeks? So before we look at the longer term, I will get to that. But just over the next few weeks, we can expect lockdown to begin to ease. All around the world, there are countries now that have gone into lockdown. Many of them similar to South Africans' lockdown. Most people have gone to lockdown, what we would now in South Africa call level 4. So they've been able to go for the shops, get some exercise every day, but mainly stay at home. And that's basically where we are now as of tomorrow morning here in South Africa, of course. And some countries have started to ease out. So South Korea, China, Japan just a little bit. New Zealand has made some announcements. But two countries to look at of interest are Austria and Germany. So they're right at the epicenter in Europe of quite significant outbreaks. And they've been able to contain them and begin to ease their lockdown. So Austria last week opened a variety of different shops, hairdressers at last, and Germany announced that young children could go back to school because they're the least vulnerable, and also open things up. But both Austria and Germany in the last 2 or 3 days have made announcements that their infection rates have increased again, and that they might have to pull back to a more restrictive lockdown. And around the world, countries are looking at South Africa and at what we've decided to do to create actual levels of lockdown. And the World Health Organization and many countries are beginning to say this looks like best practice. It looks as if South Africa has got ahead of most other countries in the world and is putting in place something that's best practice. We can argue, and of course we will argue as South Africans, we're quite good at that, and we can argue about what should happen at each level. And I think the government is being quite responsive, listening and updating their policies and regulations as they go along. But basically, the level model seems to be the best, and we'll have to see what happens each of level 4, level 3, level 2. Personally, my prediction is that we will move to level 3 probably within the next week or two, probably 2 weeks. And level 3 was probably where we'll stay for a while. And hopefully that will allow some of us to go and get haircuts and allow most of the economy to open, as long as you can guarantee physical distancing. And this is the point, the first main point that I want to make. And that is that lockdown's intention was not to cure the disease or to stop COVID. We know that we can't. I'm pretty certain, again, a prediction, it'll be interesting to hear what the prof says when he speaks later. I'm pretty certain that COVID-19 will become endemic, which basically means it will be part of our world. Almost everybody will get it. And obviously we then need to find ways to develop immunity to it, like we do to the regular flu every single year. And that might just be natural immunity, herd immunity, or it could be a vaccine. And of course, until we have a vaccine, until we have a cure for this disease, we really are going to have to accept that it will flow through society. And there is argument about how dangerous it is, how many people will die from it. But the bottom line is too many people die from it. So we do have to protect ourselves from it one way or the other. So until we have a vaccine, and of course the doc the prof will speak about this a little bit more, or until we have herd immunity, until enough people have had it, and we know that there won't be any reinfections, we have to continue physically distancing. If we don't do that, we are in danger. And now you might want to look at your screen. This is a 100-year-old graph of deaths from the Spanish flu. I'm sure you know that 100 years ago in 1918 and 19, there was a massive influenza outbreak labeled the Spanish flu. And this is a mortality chart. This is a more simplified version that you might have seen. It looks like this. And this is the danger, is that the first wave comes, we panic a little bit, we realize this is a really dangerous disease, we do a few things, and then we think we've beaten the disease and we ease off on our restrictions. And then along comes the so-called second wave. And in most pandemics that have happened in history, the second wave is more dangerous than the first. And that's the danger right now. There's a danger. We're not sure if it's possible to be reinfected. Maybe the professor can talk about that. Some people in South Korea are beginning to say that it's possible, but either that or the virus mutates, or people who just were in lockdown and then just suddenly ease, they come out into society and we've got a problem. And so the point of lockdown was not to cure the disease. The point of lockdown was not to get rid of the disease and then we're all safe again. The point was this concept of flattening the curve, which I'm sure you've heard of already, but just so that we can be clear what it is. If too many people get the disease at the same time, we will overwhelm our hospitals and our medical services. And so we need to make sure that the disease spreads slowly. If we all are possibly going to get it, and some of us, a small percentage, but still a significant number of people are going to need hospital and medical care, we want to make sure that we don't let that happen quickly. When it happens quickly, like Italy or New York or the UK, the hospitals get overwhelmed. So for me, the number I'm really watching in South Africa is not the infection rate or the death rate even, which luckily is still very low. What I'm watching most is hospital admissions. And so far, so good. We're needing to flatten the curve and to keep it flat. So that really is what we can look forward to over the next few months. So the next few weeks is probably still actually stay at home. And we heard from the health minister in South Africa just yesterday, that's still the message. Stay at home, you can do a little bit of exercise, a few more shops will open, some of you can go back to work, but mainly stay at home. And the only time when you go out, you need to make sure that you continue to physical distance from other people. I don't like the phrase social distancing, by the way. I think we should be socially connecting, but physically distancing, keeping 2 meters apart, washing our hands, sanitizing, and checking our temperature and whether we feel sick. If you feel sick, obviously don't go out into public. And of course, we've added wearing masks now to that list. And that's kind of where we are for the next few weeks. Over the next few months, what we're really going to be trying to do is to open up more and more and more of our economy and our society again. But the main thing that we need to be looking at is not the economic objectives. Now, I've put on your screen the government's economic objectives for lockdown. So this is about which businesses can be open and closed and what movement we're allowed. But the more important set of objectives is that question for the health industry. Are we ready? If we see infections rising, we have to make sure that those infections do not increase more than the hospital availability or the medical system's availability is. So infections will increase, there's no doubt about it. They will move up, and as long as they stay below the hospital readiness, we're still okay. And then we can open up more of the economy. If those infections begin to move above the hospital readiness, we're going to have to pull things back again. And the only way that we do that is with maintaining physical distancing, checking our health, keeping ourselves safe, realizing, not in fear, but realizing that this disease is out there and we have to protect ourselves from it. The good news is that it does seem as if the medical system in South Africa has done a good job. In the 6 weeks that heavy level 5 lockdown brought us, those 6 weeks have been used well. Hospitals have been prepared. Here's a picture from Charlotte Masheke Hospital, which is the main Gauteng-based COVID hospital. And they've done amazing preparations in terms of setting up processes for screening and testing and keeping COVID protocols correctly in place. It does actually look as if they're ready. Controversially, the government is bringing in medical teams from overseas, from Cuba. They're asking China to supply. Of course, there are local doctors who are internationally trained that haven't been recognized for many years in South Africa. It's been a real problem, and it looks as if the government may accredit them as well. We're going to need all hands on deck because increases in infections are coming over the next few months. I've even seen plans to turn Soccer City, the big stadium in Johannesburg, and I believe other plans are in place in Cape Town and Durban. I've just heard the guys behind the Soccer City architectural team. They have plans to, within a few weeks, they've budgeted and done the whole project plan to turn that Soccer City into an emergency field hospital that will add more than 1,000 extra beds to the ICU capacity of South Africa. So as far as I can see, the Department of Health has done a really good job of getting us prepared. But now the balancing act, and this is really the heart of what I want to talk about this morning, is there is now this balancing act for the next few months. It'll be interesting to hear what the professor tells us about BCG and the vaccine, but I'm sure that he will let us know that there are months ahead of us of testing and trials. And I would suspect that at least until the end of 2020, and probably well into next year, we are going to be balancing our economy and our medical system. And making sure that we don't have too many new infections on the medical side, that we don't have too many restrictions on the economic side. So let me give you a few examples of the implications of that for our world. The biggest one that those of you who have school-going age children or grandchildren are thinking about, and we'll hear more about this today actually here in South Africa, is schools. We're pretty certain that schools are not going to be able to reopen, just opening the gates and letting the children flood back. They're going to have to phase the children back in, probably starting with grade 12 in high school and grade 7 in primary school. Those children can go back. Why? Because we have to continue this physical distancing, this 2-meter distance. So you can't crowd all of the children back into a school classroom. You can't crowd the teachers back into a staff room. And so we have to spread those children out around multiple classrooms, maybe put them into a hall so that they can sit spaced from each other. And that means you can't let all the children back to school. Even very expensive private schools don't have the space. And of course, government township schools absolutely don't. So I'm sure that we will see an announcement of a phasing back. There may be some grades that don't go back to school at all this year. Sorry, I should have warned you about that. Some of you needed to sit down after hearing that piece of information, or maybe if you've got any whiskey left, putting some whiskey into your coffee this morning, because for some people that's a huge stress. And I suppose this is why I chose this example as my first example of the implications for our economy, because there's a massive knock-on effect here. You might want your staff back at work, but if their children are not back at school, some of your staff have to stay at home. They have to look after their children. Maybe we need some community activities where tennis clubs and bowls clubs and churches and mosques and so on open up their buildings so that a few kids can be dropped off in a daycare type environment, and we get people in the community looking after other people's children. Of course, it's not ideal, but it's better than going back to school, and it's definitely better than them having to stay at home with no parents if the parents have to go to work. So our whole society is going to have to change over the next few months because, and I come back to my main point, this is not just a few weeks. We're not just gritting our teeth till the end of May and then we go back to normal. And certainly tomorrow, the 1st of May, is not back to normal, not by any stretch of the imagination. So we've got probably 12 to 18 months of deep and serious disruption here. Now, if you're trying to think about this from a business opportunity, well, then obviously companies that are involved in online education and in digital tools that are used for education and homeschooling, they're going to be in the pound seats now. That's why Google's stock price is going up. That's why Zoom is doing so well. But it might also be that hotels, conference centers, tennis and bowls clubs that have empty buildings that are not really going to be used at the moment, maybe they can begin to think about repurposing that space on a paid-for basis for things like daycare for children and so on. We've got to start thinking differently about the facilities and infrastructure we've got and what can and can't be used. So a second example, just to push my point home about the fact that we've got a long few months ahead of us now in terms of disruption, is airlines. How do you physical distance on an airline, on an aeroplane? Maybe some of you are used to turning left when you walk into an aeroplane and you only sit in the big business class seats up front. But even that is not 2 meters between people. So every other business class seat has to be left empty. But in the economy side, you've basically got to leave every other row empty, or only put 1 person per row. So even if you are allowed to fly an airplane again and people are allowed to fly, is it economically viable to fly with a half or third empty plane? Probably not. And even if it is economically viable to do it, will a lot of your customers choose not to fly? That's certainly me. I normally do between 200 and 250 flights a year, traveling all over the world, speaking at conferences and leadership development programs. I'm not getting on an airplane anytime this year unless I'm sure that I'm not going to get COVID. And I'm not sure how we will be sure. Think of restaurants as another example. If you've got to sit people 2 meters apart, you've either got to build cubicles in your restaurant or you've got to go at half capacity. Can you afford to do that? Well, each business is going to have to make these decisions for themselves. Sadly, there are no right or wrong answers here. There are no easy solutions here. We're all going to have to make tough decisions. So if that's the next few months, which is only opening up the economy if we can control that infection rate, and then only opening up the bits of the economy where we can guarantee that physical distancing and people's safety, what does it look like a few years from now? Because there's no doubt we will deal with this disease. Herd immunity or a vaccine or just us generally all getting it and then finding out who has an ability to deal with it in their own systems, whatever happens, 3 or 4 years from now, the crisis will be over. But I don't think that we will go back to normal. Let me give you a few examples. I think there's going to be a massive shift in geopolitics and macroeconomics. So a simple example is countries are going to be thinking about what needs to be inside their borders versus what is imported and outsourced. A few, 2 months ago now, if you can remember that far back in history, there was the great toilet paper rush of February 2020. Mainly started in Australia, because as far as I understand, in Australia, they don't have any local toilet paper suppliers. So it wasn't irrational to suddenly realize that if China is going to lock down and not be able to do exports, you actually might run out of toilet paper. Here in South Africa, though, I suppose we were listening to all of our friends who live in Australia, and we didn't need to go out and hoard toilet paper because we have a number of toilet paper suppliers in South Africa. It's just an example, but it's an example of what we're going to have to think about after lockdown, because some people are discovering that things they want to get, they can't get because exports are not happening. The supply chain is not what it should be. The offshoring of goods and services is not helpful. I think there will be a massive reevaluation of that. That'll be done country by country, but it'll also be done company by company. As companies have maybe realized that some of their supply chains are a little bit too fragile. There'll also be a realization that I want to get going again. Let's say in a month or two's time, we discover that actually Africa has dodged a bullet. Southern Africa, we've really flattened the curve. We can open up the economy entirely. Wouldn't that be a wonderful best case scenario? And now we're ready to do business. But Europe is in chaos still. America still hasn't dealt with their first wave. They're over 1 million infections just today. And, you know, maybe there's a second wave in Germany, and Brazil still hasn't dealt with stuff. And you might discover your normal trading partners are not available for trade at the moment. They're not responsive because they're in crisis. Whereas countries like New Zealand or Australia or South Korea or even possibly India, China, all of these places are open for business. There's going to be the potential in the second half of 2020 for a massive realignment of global geopolitics and economics. And imagine if Africa does flatten the curve, and then people are starting to look for investment opportunities. An IMF webinar earlier this week suggested that this could be a significant moment for inflowing investment into Africa if the current trajectory continues. All of this is speculation at the moment. I'm not making predictions. These are just scenarios. But there is the possibility of a once in a lifetime, literally, shift in geopolitics. I also need to remind you that every disruption that was coming is still coming. So all of the digital disruptions, all of the disruptions coming to every industry through automation and artificial intelligence and robotics, All of those are still going to come. We might have had a 2 or 3 month pause as everybody deals with the crisis. In fact, let me suggest to you that AI and robotics and automation might have been accelerated now, as many industries begin to say, we'd prefer to not have workers at all. I have a number of clients in the mining industry, and that's been their talk over the last few weeks, is to say, let's just use this as an excuse or a reason to accelerate the automation disruption that was already on its way. All of that's still coming, and those disruptions are going to continue at pace in addition to the COVID disruptions. So we are in for one hell of a decade of the 2020s coming our way. And we've only just begun, and there's a lot more coming our way. So what should we do? How should we respond? I think very, very simply, my message is this. We cannot hope or pray for us to go back to normal. There is no normal to go back to. At a philosophical level, personally, I even believe that the normal we had is part of the problem. So I don't even want to go back to normal, even if we could. But in my opinion, we can't go back. Too much is going to change in the next few months for us to ever be able to recover what we had. Some industries will get close, but most industries are going to be deeply, deeply disrupted. And the disruption will be significant and forever. In other words, it's a bit of a cliche already, but there is a new normal about to emerge. And what I think we need to be doing, whether we're doing it just as investors or as clients and customers, or whether we are business owners, and we've got to make decisions about the medium and long-term plans and prospects for our businesses. Whatever the reason, I think you've got to accept that we're looking at a blank slate, the biggest blank slate anybody could have imagined. And we've got to get an opportunity mindset of working out what to draw on that blank slate. Yes, sadly, for some of us, that means our hopes and dreams and everything we've built up for the last 20 or 30 years is lying in a smoldering heap. And sadly, there isn't great news for some people in some industries. But the best entrepreneurs and the best investors will pick themselves up, will look for the opportunity, and they will find it, because there are immense opportunities. As long as we accept as soon as possible that now is the time for change, not for holding on, that now is a time for creativity and entrepreneurship. So that is my message. Sorry, Thijs, I wasn't brought on as a motivational speaker. I hope it's been useful. I hope it's been interesting. I hope it's been helpful. And in the end, I hope it does help people to stand up and steel themselves for what lies ahead. But I know that it probably hasn't been good news to hear that we are in for a lengthy disruption and probably will never go back to life as we knew it. But Thijs, I know you've had a number of questions that have been sent your way, and I know that there have also been some questions that have come in while I've been talking. So let me hand back to you and see what we can do by way of some answers here.
Yeah. Graham, thank you very much. Thanks for those insights. I'm going to go off script a little bit, because I gather from some of the questions that's been coming through that there's been a bit of groupthink amongst the business community, and you spoke about that balancing act. And I would like to say we may win the battle, but we'll lose the war. And I find that the media, and for now, I will group you into that media sort of contingent, seems to have lost perspective in terms of what is happening to the economy. I mean, the damage to an already fragile economy is huge. And the number of deaths that we've seen thus far, one doesn't want to belittle that, but is insignificant compared to the damage that can be done. So maybe some comments about the lack of emphasis on the economic realities before we move on to some of the other questions.
Thijs, I think it probably would have been very helpful if the government, during the last few weeks in their announcements, about their plans for lockdown and so on if the government had merely acknowledged the point that you've made. Because I mean, you know, Cyril Ramaphosa himself is a businessman. He's a politician, but he's been in business long enough not to just only have government experience. So he knows, and his task teams, the economic task team, is headed by Maria Ramos. These are people who understand this, who are, I would guess, as deeply invested in an understanding of the damage to the economy as any of us are. I think it would have been helpful if they had just talked about that and just not ignored that or just been silent on the issue. But I still do go back to my point. Tess, look, we're obviously going to hear from the Prof in a few seconds. It might be that through the BCG vaccine or through some other things that are unique to us as Africans, that we have some kind of immunity. And if that's the case, we can go back and retrofit what we might have liked from the economy and say it was never ever going to be as much of a medical crisis as we might have imagined. But to be fair to the decisions that were made at the time that they are being made, imagine we had seen a United States type infection level. Imagine we had 1 million people infected in our country, with tens and hundreds of thousands of people dying. We can't imagine, as people who have access to the economy, who have our private medical aid schemes and so on, we can't imagine that that would have all just happened outside the walls of our properties. The governments would nationalize private hospitals. You wouldn't have access to a hospital even if you wanted one and could afford it. In Ecuador, they literally had dead people piled up on the streets. It's a horrible picture and a horrible thing to say. So honestly, we will have this debate the rest of our lives, I'm sure, Tace, because we can't see what might have happened if we did something else. But I think that if the government moves quickly now in the next few weeks to ease up the economy and maintain that infection rate, again, we're not trying to keep the infection rate to zero. We're just trying to keep it below what the medical system can handle. I think we might look back and say we did a good job, because I think we're going to see soon a massive spike in infections in the townships, and we're going to realize what might have been when we weren't prepared 5 or 6 weeks ago. So sorry, Tace, it's a long answer. I won't take as long to answer all of them. I hear you. We have to open the economy now, but I think the balancing act is equally important.
These are two quite sort of controversial comments stroke questions. The first is, don't you think that the COVID-19 is a convenient smokescreen for the communists and socialists in the South African government to ultimately gain control and to impose their ideology? And I'm going to give you the next one as well. You can deal with them consequentially. But the shots are being called by the medical profession, with all due respect. And ultimately, the business community, business and taxpayers will have to foot the bill. Aren't we listening too much to the medical professionals rather than to the business people? So those two comments or questions, please.
Okay, so your second question is pretty much the same as what I've just answered. So I won't literally repeat myself. Remember that Cyril Ramaphosa is married to a medical doctor, and he himself is a business person. And so even in his own personal household, I think both those voices are equally measured. Yes, of course, our health minister has been out front most of the time. And as I say, I think it would have been nice to hear from Minister Patel and others, maybe more over the last few weeks. And I think we will hear more from them in the next few weeks. But the government set up 7, if I understand correctly, 7 task forces, 3 of which were economically focused. Only one was medical and one was education. There were a few others. So again, I think that we will see the government now responding to the economics. Now, to your other question, the first question there, it depends. So let's just get rid of conspiracy theories first of all. I definitely don't think that COVID-19 has been created somewhere by some economic or political Illuminati somewhere to try and get through some kind of globalist agenda or so on. So assuming that's not what the question was asking, if it was, I'd reject those conspiracy theories out of hand. But I do believe that we have to keep an eye on what's happening. All around the world, authoritarian politicians are taking a gap. In Hungary, the leader there has wanted to be a dictator for many years, and he's literally shut down parliament, shut down journalists, shut down the constitution, so much so that the European Union is even having conversations about kicking Hungary out of the European Union. In India, I think, has done the same with Prime Minister Modi, basically putting journalists in jail and so on for anything he doesn't like. And I honestly do think that all around the world, we must be careful and vigilant. And I think our journalists are starting to do a good job of questioning whether, in fact, some of the things that might be happening right now are less to do with medical science and evidence-based best practice, and more to do with political agendas. And I think that that's a valid question. And we as citizens need to be active in making sure that if our government uses emergency powers, they stay emergency, and that we have a way of coming away from these powers as soon as possible. Probably the best historical example here is the Patriot Act that the Americans put into law after 9/11 and then never bothered to take out of law. And on the basis of the Patriot Act, Obama and Trump have been able to make all sorts of human rights abuses at home and around the world, and everything from surveillance to convenient wars. And they should always have made the Patriot Act an emergency response that was then repealed quickly. And we need to make sure that we do the same in our countries, whichever countries we're in.
Thanks, Graham. Graham, perhaps comments about globalization and urbanization. I mean, we've received many questions around that. Do you think that globalization has peaked, and is urbanization likely to slow down?
Sure. These are two big scenarios. I think it's too early to say, to be honest. I think we're all still in crisis mode, and we're going to have to see what happens as we emerge from crisis. I think probably the biggest answer to the globalization question is who the next president of America is. If Donald Trump manages to delay the election, that's a possible scenario, very outlier, but if he manages to delay it, or if he's re-elected in October, I think that's the biggest threat to globalization. It looks as if President Xi in China will definitely use this crisis to do what he wanted to do anyway, which is extend his term beyond the 10 years. And if Xi and Trump keep going at each other for another 4 years, globalization is very, very hurt. If we have a change in leadership in America, that will be the biggest signal that that scenario is not going to happen. But there's still, as I said in my presentation, a huge scenario around companies and countries onshoring or bringing certain key industries home again, and bringing certain facilities home again. So right now, I'm not sure, but I think we're leaning towards a scenario where globalization is at risk at the moment, and nationalization, in both good and bad ways, is probably the more likely scenario over the next 3 to 5 years. A slightly philosophical. Sorry, Tace, just a quick final comment on that. A slightly philosophical answer to that is that actually globalization might increase dramatically. After the Second World War, we got the United Nations. After the First World War, we got the League of Nations. It might be that we realize the only way to respond to a global pandemic is for all the world to work together. And let's be honest, the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the G20, NATO, the European Union have all badly let us down in terms of leadership, coordination, responsiveness to this pandemic. So there might be a complete re-evaluation and reworking of global power structures. But sure, there's a lot of scenarios there. We're not sure what will happen.
I mean, we've got so many questions in there, and we've got so little
We
time.
knew this would happen, Tace. We knew this would happen.
Indeed, we only have a minute left, but I'm going to sort of drop two more questions in your lap.
I'll be
the
brief.
first is, do you think that rampant consumerism and irrational spending and wasteful spending will abate? That's the first question. And I think we must now accept that work from home is going to become the norm. And some companies have been very successful at it. And what do you think were the key reasons for their success to be able to implement a work from home policy successfully? So those were the final two questions.
Those are two fantastic questions because they allow me to wrap up and summarize what I was saying. So the first question about changing consumer habits, my answer is I really hope so. And this was the point I was trying to make. I think that a lot of us are sitting in our homes, evaluating our lives and our life choices. And I hope that we don't simply try and go back to normal afterwards. I hope some of us have looked at our cupboards and said, actually, you know what, I've got too many clothes. Or I didn't need all of that stuff that I was spending money on. And I've now, been forced to change my budget. And actually, this works better for me. So I personally hope that there won't be an overreaction to the markets opening. There might be in the first 2 or 3 weeks as people just go on a spending spree. But longer term, I hope people have had a chance to think and maybe make some different life choices. And that leads to a nice example around work from home. We are in the middle of the greatest future of work experiment in the history of humanity, the work from home experiment. Tace, I've worked from home for 18 years. I've run my company, Tomorrow Today Global, for 18 years. We haven't paid a cent in rentals during that time. I have a team across 4 different continents. We've had 100 people working for us over those 2 decades, never paid rental at all. And I think that that might be one of the big trends coming out of this. Now, the question was, what made those people succeed? I think 3 things will help you succeed in a work from home environment. And none of them have got to do with your setup at home. The first is a mindset shift. You can't just take your office home. Working from home is not the same as doing what you were doing in the office, but now you're just doing it at home. What I mean by that is don't work office hours. If office hours don't work for you, don't work office hours. If you're a manager, don't force your team to work from 9 until 5. Ask your team, what are the outputs that you need? If they were going to give you 8 hours, well, then let them chunk those 8 hours up. So the first thing is a shift in mindset. You don't just try and duplicate the office at home. The second thing is exactly that point of not micromanaging. We must move towards output-based management or deliverables-based management. So you don't check how many hours people are working or how they work. You check whether they deliver what you wanted to. And I think that leaders and companies that had that mindset already have found this adjustment easier. And then, of course, thirdly, is the companies that were already in process of digital disruption. They had already started the process of using digital tools, upgrading everybody's digital technology, changing the mindset around locking your computer and your phone and giving people the latest smartphones and being a little bit freer in a digital space. They were ready for this, and the transition was easy. Companies that have been resisting digital disruption, they've been caught short. So it's not too late. We're in this process. I think that there are many millions of people who will never go back to the office. Whatever else we're missing during lockdown, I don't think anybody's missing rush hour traffic. So why would you choose to do that again? So there's a new normal for us to go forward to, and it might be a good new normal with a few tough years between now and then. Thanks, Tace.
Graham, thank you very much. If you have time, remain on. Well, we are very privileged to have Professor Peter with us. I met Johnny because he cured me from a disease called chronic idiopathic urticaria. For those of you that don't know, it's itchy, uncomfortable, ugly-looking sort of red blotch all over your face and body. And I got to know him, and I then decided to join his research on the topic. And I was so impressed that when I found out that he's doing research on DCG, that I would also like to make a contribution to that, and then to also assist him in raising money. So Johnny, thank you very much. Johnny is one of those people that is full of energy, enthusiasm, and he's the one professional that always responds on WhatsApp, be it public, unlike some of the other people that I know, even my colleagues, and most definitely my architect, but be it a public holiday, early in the morning, late at night, he's always available. So as I said, when I found out that he's going to do the research on BCG and whether there's any link with COVID-19, I decided to support him. But without any further ado, Professor Johnny Peter, thank you.
Thanks very much, Tace, for that introduction. I'm just going to try and share my screen here and put up this show. So I think it's been really great as well to hear from Graham. And I wanted to start actually, even before I talk specifically about the BCG in the context of COVID, is perhaps sort of contextualize that, you know, even within the science field and research and healthcare, there's definitely a new normal. And one of the things to highlight, and I'm going to talk specifically about a few publications and things that have, you know, happened in this specific field of BCG, which is that the scientific process, which is normally actually slow, very iterative, it's moving at an unprecedented pace at the moment. What's happened is you are seeing a huge amount of preprint exposures, and I even saw, you know, 2 days ago, they've been talking about a trial in an antiviral medication that they were talking about the results before they even seemed to have any results. I couldn't find the actual results, but somebody was on a webinar talking about a drug that was working. So they're all this sort of rush of preprint material and scientists working on different things. And with that, what's often happens then is that the public, and I should say the media, is looking for answers. We're all looking for answers in all different ways. And what that means is often that then there's the media attention on a particular kind of non-peer-reviewed scientific article or scientific discovery or opinion that is then, you know, starts to have a life of its own. And so I think that comes with a lot of potential dangers and cautions. And I think that really in the scientific community at the moment, we have to almost keep our heads about things so that we don't compromise quality for the necessity of speed. And so I think that that's the first thing to say. On the flip side of that, I think we should also stop in the healthcare and scientific communities and just really give credit to the incredible amount of information around SARS-CoV-2 that we already have gotten since the fact that we really only started seeing this 4 months ago. So, I mean, just to give an example, we already have sequence data on the virus. So we understand what virus it is. We understand the sequence. We have several papers already outlining the immunological response in the host to the virus. We have several thousands of people being enrolled almost daily into clinical trials in treatments. We have 2 very promising vaccine candidates and several other specific COVID vaccine candidates that have been announced. And so I think that we've got to balance these 2 things within the scientific community at the moment. So I guess within that context, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our own project and specifically about the use, or should I say the repurposing of BCG vaccine for possible benefit to protect particularly frontline healthcare workers and other frontline workers against infection and or severe outcomes from SARS-CoV-2 and the disease that it causes, COVID. And I think the first thing to note here, because I think Graham was mentioning this, and I'm happy to take general questions around the sort of immunology and specifics about COVID vaccine, but what I'm talking about today is in fact BCG. And I wanted to start with this because I have been I did my PhD in TB diagnostic research. And so I've been focused on various aspects of TB for most of my career. And I think many South African academics are. And the reason is quite simply this, and it's well captured by this quote of the previous health minister, Aaron Matsaledi, on World TB Day almost a decade ago now, where he compared TB and HIV to a snake that is moving through sub-Saharan Africa, and the head of the snake is in South Africa and the teeth are in KwaZulu-Natal. And that really speaks to the fact that we unfortunately have the largest epicenters of the dual, what they often refer to as syndemics of HIV and TB in South Africa. And it's estimated that 1 in 100 South Africans have TB infection. And I think I'm going to talk more a bit about this and try to draw the distinction here between TB infection, or what some people refer to as latent TB, and the number of cases of active TB we have, which is of course much, much lower than this, but still a significant burden. So what about BCG? Well, these are kind of the famous people from Mycobacterium tuberculosis discovery. The first gentleman is Robert Koch, and he was the microbiologist that identified the Mycobacterium tuberculosis as the etiological factor that causes tuberculosis. And then Kalmit and Gurin, they are the first people to have developed a vaccine for TB. And they developed what is the BCG vaccine, which is literally stands for Bacillus Kalmit-Guerin vaccine. And just to explain what this vaccine is a live attenuated vaccine. So what the word attenuated means is that they basically take a related species of Mycobacterium, so another bug or mycobacterial organism, and they do something called passage of it. So they grow it through different cycles of growth, and they remove certain virulence of the organism. So that over time, what you deal with is you have a lot of very, very similar molecules in the mycobacterium, but you don't have the danger of causing severe infection like you would with tuberculosis. And BCG vaccine is now almost 100 years old. And what's interesting is if you look at it for TB, why do we still use it? So in South Africa, if you look on the left here, we have mandatory birth vaccines, and Tace was mentioning 1973, which was the year where it was universal across South Africa in the expanded vaccine program. But even before that, probably from the late 1940s or early 1950s, many people in South Africa would have been receiving BCG. But why do we still use it? And we use it mainly for its benefits and efficacy in protecting against severe childhood forms of TB. So particularly TB meningitis, which is a devastating condition with both mortality and morbidity, and then other forms of disseminated or extrapulmonary forms of TB. What BCG unfortunately doesn't protect you very well against is the commonest form of TB in adults, which is standard pulmonary TB. And also, of course, TB in the context of HIV. And basically, just to highlight the figure here, that in South Africa, 60% of new TB cases still occur in HIV-positive patients. It also doesn't protect children against post-primary TB. So that's the reason why there's certainly globally ongoing initiatives to look for novel TB vaccines. And what's interesting about BCG is this article from Cell is actually by two colleagues of mine from the Institute of Infectious Diseases at UCT. And it highlights the fact that even today, we are reconsidering the use of BCG as a kind of adjunctive vaccine in developing protection against TB. And this is a commentary where they look at giving BCG in new ways. So the traditional way that you give a BCG in vaccine is to the left upper arm. So it's given intradermally. But there are, of course, other methods. And so people are looking at, you can aerosolize it, you can breathe in mycobacterium into the BCG into the lungs. You can even, this is a study in rhesus macaques looking at intravenous injection of BCG. And actually, some of those methods look to be much more effective for preventing actual TB in the lung. And additionally, BCG is being looked at to be boosted. So they've been changing some genes in BCG and also adding it to other vaccines, often giving it in what's called the prime boost strategy, where you give BCG initially and then you give a second vaccine with a new type of molecule in it to stimulate vaccine. So that's the standard approach and its use at the moment for TB. So how did BCG jump into the kind of media or the public perception? And I sort of talked a little bit about this right at the beginning, but this public preprint publication, and I actually have not yet seen the full peer-reviewed publication for this, is this paper about Miller, where Miller and colleagues are epidemiologists. And essentially what they've done is they looked at, they took data on BCG vaccinations policies across the globe. They took a number of COVID cases and deaths related to COVID cases in late March. And they put these correlations together, which suggested that countries that never had universal BCG policies, you can see here they've highlighted Italy, Netherlands, US, compared to low middle income countries that had universal BCG policies, perhaps had lower rates of death and also lower rates of COVID cases. Now, unfortunately, this paper, if you look at it with a critical eye and you understand different things, is really flawed in many, many ways. And in fact, Tace recently circulated something from JP Morgan where they described it as sloppy science. And I quite like that term. And really, the main flaws of this paper are, number one, it's the stage of the epidemic. So the case burden of COVID and the deaths related to it, particularly in low middle income countries, are completely different now a month after they did this analysis. So if you redid the same analysis now, you might not pick up the same effect. The other problem is that all these big studies at the country level suffer from something called ecological fallacy. And what that is that you cannot extrapolate your variable of assessment is a country. So you're trying to compare countries with different BCGs to an individual level effect. And that's a problem. You cannot extrapolate individual health benefit from something that you see on the country level. And then, of course, they don't explain some of the obvious gaps or the obvious exceptions, such as countries like Germany and Australia that also have very low mortality rates, but yet don't have any BCG vaccination schedules. So really that was something that the media grabbed onto, this paper, but actually was a very poorly done scientific study. However, what is got a lot more of a robust evidence base is, in fact, that BCG has a lot of non-specific effects. And this was noted right early from the 1920s, where they noted that BCG vaccine was able to reduce infant mortality independent of its TB effects. And those early studies have now actually been subsequently confirmed in 3 randomized controlled trials amongst infants. And so undoubtedly, BCG offers protection against all and for all-cause mortality that extends beyond its benefit of TB in children who are vaccinated at birth. So probably this effect is 1 to 2 years. And what seems to be the story is that we call this BCG's ability to induce protection to unrelated infectious agents. It's either referred to as non-specific effects or something called the heterologous effects of BCG. And this is a table which really summarizes that. So for any of you that are very interested in the detail, you can check out this review article. And I think it summarizes it nicely. And essentially what it says is that if you look at some animal models and you look at small amounts of human models, number one, BCG seems to confer some non-specific protection against other infections. It can also boost the responses that people get to other vaccines. So for instance, if you look in here, there is a picture on a study on influenza A, where if people have received BCG vaccine and then got boosted with influenza A, they made better antibody responses. They made a better immune response to the other vaccine. And similarly, we've seen that for yellow fever vaccine too. So clearly, there's actually quite a lot of benefits. Then the other thing that's very interesting is that it's used as an immunotherapy in several places. It's used to treat warts and help them to get better. And it's used very commonly to treat non-invasive bladder cancer. So in patients that present with bladder cancer, they get intravesical. So BCG is put into the bladder for these sort of non-muscle invasive tumors. And the results are often very promising, and it's a very effective therapy in this group of patients. So it's actually got several wide benefits. Now, I won't burden you too much with the immunological details of this, but one of the most promising potential mechanisms behind this is this last point here, which is a concept called trained immunity. And essentially, there are different arms of your immune system that do different jobs. And one of the things that BCG seems to do is it changes the genetic program. So something we call epigenetics. So it changes the way that your DNA opens and its ability to produce more rapid responses of your immune system when it sees other related molecules. So that seems to be one of its most important immunological mechanism by how these effects are being seen. So, but what about getting now specifically to how it relates to COVID and how it relates to respiratory infections? The problem comes in here that there's very limited evidence to date. There is, however, enough evidence to suggest that there might be an effect. And the two trials that we have here that are worth looking at is the one is a small trial in Taiwanese elderly patients where they were given monthly injections of BCG. So that's one injection every month for 3 months. And what they noted was a significant reduction in respiratory tract infection. And of course, SARS-CoV-2 is predominantly a respiratory tract infection. And in fact, there's also local data, which was almost accidentally collected. There was an adolescent trial, in Cape Town, in Worcester, well, actually not really in Cape Town, but in the Western Cape, done by our own South African TB Vaccines Initiative, where they were looking at the effects of boosting adolescents with a second dose of BCG to protect them against TB infection. And what they noted in the group that received BCG versus those that received nothing is they noted a 3-fold reduction in upper respiratory tract infections. But of course, there was no discrimination there between viral infections or bacterial infections. So it was difficult to know whether that's, whether that will really translate to any meaningful effect to SARS-CoV-2. And also there was a small sample size. So on the basis of really that more robust scientific data and certainly clinical equipoise, there's definitely justification to look at it in the context of SARS-CoV-2. And currently there are now several. So I've listed here the 2 biggest randomized controlled trials that are currently ongoing. The Australian BRACE trial, coordinated through Murdoch University. They are looking to enroll up to 8,000 healthcare workers. There's a trial in the Netherlands as well, and a lot of the original immunological work has been coordinated by the PI of that trial, which is Nihai Mita from the Netherlands. And actually what's interesting is there's now a group of us, we're all discussing on email, collaborating in relationship to all of these different trials. There are probably another 7 or 8 that are planned in different populations. And actually, I'll tell you this later, but one of the real benefits and things that is planned because of this unprecedented speed of which science is moving is to actually do meta-analysis as each of these trials produce data to look at where the other trials are at and to include them so that we can really try to understand the true effect of these across different populations. But what you may ask then is if all these other people are doing, why do we need to spend limited resources to look at this in South Africa with another trial? Well, the truth of the matter is, like I showed you in the beginning slide, with 1 in 100 people having latent TB, we have a very different population to Australia or to the Netherlands. So the first thing is we have BCG birth vaccination. The second thing is that we have very high rates of latent TB infection. Now, this is distinct from active TB with lung damage and things like that, which we actually worry makes you a vulnerable, high-risk patient for developing severe illness. This is people that have an immune response to TB, and they are fighting a small amount of TB, but only 2% of those people will actually go on to develop active TB. And in fact, the latent TB might do the same job potentially as a current BCG vaccine. We also have high rates of HIV in our population. And then we have high rates of something called environmental mycobacterium. And these are found in the sort of subtropical regions, and they're most of sub-Saharan Africa and extending into South Africa. And they are known to modulate some of the effects of modern BCG, modern TB vaccines, and they might also mitigate or reduce the benefits. So it's kind of within that background that TASK, which is connected with the University of Stellenbosch and headed by Andreas Dacon, coordinated to set up a randomized trial of BCG in our healthcare workers, which we will, it's a very simple study design where we will randomize 1-to-1 to either a BCG vaccine in the arm or no vaccine, or a placebo vaccine in the arm. So it's placebo controlled, so we won't know it, we'll be blinded. And then we will look at hospitalization rates to COVID amongst these healthcare workers and other things like absenteeism, actual infections, and several other secondary endpoints. But the study design is very safe. Although we have 52 weeks planned, there's several interim points given the speed at which things are moving. The first interim analysis will be at 10 weeks. And so we will try to be able to keep up with what's going on internationally. We're aiming at the moment at a minimum of 500 workers, but we actually would like to get to 1,000 and even 1,500, but sample sizes unfortunately need funding, and that's a balance. So one of the things that I think is very important in this time is to really think about the outcome. What can we hope to achieve? Why should we do it, and what's the outcome? And I think this is a trial where there's really a win-win independent of the outcome. And let me just explain that briefly. So the first is, should the trial be positive, in other words, we show that BCG vaccination does in fact protect our healthcare workers, well then we've got 100,000 frontline healthcare workers, and we don't know, the honest truth is we don't know how long SARS-CoV is going to be around, and we would be able to then protect people for what might be a 6 to 12 months or even longer period of potential exposures. And potentially we could then look to also study it in elderly populations or high-risk populations. So that has obvious economic benefits. But equally so, on the other side of that, if the trial is negative in South Africa, and this might be distinct from results in other parts of the world, it would be a considerable saving of resources for the Department of Health, which is already having to decide on how to spend its money. And then another very important thing is that the supply chain for infant BCG, and I showed you how important the benefits were for infants to get their BCG, it might be disrupted if there's a global run on BCG vaccination for healthcare workers. And this is a very cautionary graph that I want to show you just as one of my last slides here. This is a graph from the Stellenbosch group, Anneke Hesseling's group, where they basically show here the spike in this last bar here shows a spike in TB meningitis cases in 2- and 3-year-olds in 2017. And what this is correlated with is a reduction of 50% in the supply chain of BCG to the Western Cape 2 years before in 2015. So this is just a word of caution that we must be really sure that it's going to work to potentially put this kind of these kind of lives on the line in terms of any disruption to the supply of BCG for vaccinating our children. And that's very important. So just to wrap up there, what have we done for funding? And part of, again, it's unprecedented as an academic for me to be talking much to a sort of business audience in a way of raising funds. That's also quite unprecedented. And the reason for this is that we are, as academics now, we wanting to get the results and get these trials up and running as fast as we can. We are also going and applying for routine traditional routes. So we've submitted an application to the European Developing Clinical Trials Partnership Network, which are a European funder. Obviously, the applications for that are very competitive, but we've submitted a grant for that. We've also applied to our local medical funders, the Department of Science and Technology, the South African Medical Research Council, and they hopefully will give us a degree of support, but they are now also looking to support several other trials of treatment. We will get BCG vaccines donated by the Department of Health, so that will be in-kind support. But really, to hit a mark of roughly 10 million, which is what we need to finance the trial, we have needed to turn to private donor support. I'm very pleased to say that largely with TACE's support, we've raised just over R1 million already. We have a Lung Institute Trust to receive donations and to give out 18A certificates. And so we'll continue to look and really try when we can get the maximum amount of funding to really keep enrolling and really get the power of the study to be optimal to produce a significant result. I'll end there and take questions.
Johnny, thank you very much for that. I would like to sort of kick off by sort of mentioning and asking two things. There's an Afrikaans saying that goes, "Gogga maak vir baba bang," which basically means it's much to do about nothing. If we look at the South African death rate and the enormous damage that's been done to the economy, aren't we completely overreacting towards COVID-19? So maybe a couple of comments around that. And I know it's not your main field of expertise, but it'd be interesting to hear your comments.
So I think there are a couple of things to say there. And I think we've been in the medical community, I think, to start by saying we've actually been very impressed by the medical leadership from the Department of Health and from the NICD and Sim Karim's group heading up the task team for the department. And I think the main comments that I would say relates, and a lot of the action of the South African government relates in the health context to the perceived vulnerability of our 9 million HIV infected patients. So just to give you another statistic, so influenza virus, which we know kills 100 to 300,000 people a year and can cause considerable mortality. We know that the infection risk for HIV patients, irrespective of whether they're on antiretroviral therapy, is the same for influenza. However, the mortality rate, should they be infected, is estimated at 25 to 50 times higher and 50 times to 100-fold higher if they're not on any antiretroviral therapy. So, and then we have a considerable burden of patients living with chronic lung disease secondary to TB. And I think that the government's drastic decisions around the strategies that we have put in place in this country have related to the perceived vulnerability of those two groups of people. And the initial estimates were in the hundreds of thousands to millions of deaths in that population of our vulnerable population. So I think that it's very tough. And unfortunately, when you make steps that do prevent things, then it's very easy to, point the finger and say this was much to do about nothing. But I think that the data that they had at that time, and still we don't know the answer in HIV infected cases, we will likely find that out in the coming 4 to 8 weeks, I would estimate. But I think that data was very alarming and estimated that a pandemic of SARS-CoV-2 could be 20 to 50-fold more devastating in our own country than in some of the developed country settings that we are compared to. So I think that that's the first thing I would say, general comment. And then the second, to say that I think we are, like Graham says, we are predicted to have a continued surge in South Africa. And we will, as we ease lockdown, see an increased caseload. So we could have a different conversation in 2 months' time. That's the truth of the speed at which this thing's moving. And so I still think there will be some considerable mortality attributable to this disease in South Africa.
Thank you. Hopefully all of you have now listened to Professor Johnny Pieter. I never sort of envisaged that he will name and shame the three of us that had already donated, but I believe it's a very, very worthwhile cause. And how do you eat an elephant? Bit by bit. So small contributions will be welcome. And I really think we need to get this over the line. So for those of you that are interested in making a contribution, please contact Johnny and his team directly, or otherwise you can even call my office. Johnny, should you not raise all the money, would you be able to proceed with the trial?
Yeah, so we will basically, so a lot of our staff, I mean, we've had staff as well that are working on other research groups that are unable to conduct that research right now. So both TASK and the UCT Lung Institute has got in-kind staff time that we are already starting to put in place and work towards. So we will do everything we can to vaccinate as many people as we can. And this trial design that we set up suggests that, you know, we'll get to 500 and then we'll keep going. And as I mentioned to you, what's great is that all of the BCG trialists around the world are communicating. So even if we do not reach our full target, we will be able to contribute data to interim analyses in other places that would help to potentially bring us to a more clear understanding of the true effect of BCG. So we will we will do everything we can to achieve our target sample size, but even if we fall short of that, the trial data will be valuable for all the reasons I've mentioned.
Are you kicking off when with the actual clinical trial?
So Tigerberg will start enrolling on Monday. So they will be the start. So they start on Monday, putting patients or healthcare workers on the front line with giving them vaccines. We probably have a 10-day turnaround time now for our Human Research Ethics Council, but this will be helped by the fact that the regulatory body of South Africa has already approved the trial. So we hope to kick off in 2 weeks' time with our own vaccines.
Then 3 last sort of rapid fire questions. The first one is, don't we weaken the immune systems of our healthy people by quarantining them, firstly? The second one is, a comment has been made that Africa, the deaths in Africa is actually relatively low, and not all of Africa have had BCG vaccinations. The second question. And then the third one is, the UK had compulsory BCG between 1953 and 2005, but they've got one of the highest COVID mortality rates. If you could sort of deal with those 3. Sorry about the rapid fire nature of the questions.
No worries. I think I'll start with the 2 that are related, the last 2. So the first thing to say is that I don't put any significant scientific weight in birth BCG vaccine being protective in any way for COVID. So I don't believe any of the science that links these epidemiological. I think that it's not good science. So first thing to say is that I think that the benefit you'll get for the BCG will be related to immediate effects, right? So I don't think that the benefit's going to be longer than even a year to 2 years maximum. So that's why we recommend current vaccine, and that's what we're trialing. And the infants got protection in the first year after their birth one, but I don't really think that those data have anything worthwhile considering. The other thing around Africa and other patients is there are several biological factors. There's also several other immunology studies that we are looking to have conducted in African populations related to their genomes, their immunological structures, which might also mean that the epidemiology of the disease might be different. So I don't think BCG at birth has anything to do with an impact that we're seeing. Current BCG, different story. That's the first point. And then to answer your the very first question about the quarantine, just to say that the quarantining, obviously sunlight, vitamin D, all those normal things that we think about may offer some boosting, and there's some data around that. But specifically, I don't think a period of quarantine will actually impair people's immunological systems on its own, provided that people can get enough food and they can get enough sunlight. So I think that one of the big problems in South Africa that we are struggling with is the hunger-related issue. And undoubtedly, if people are not getting food, then it's going to be a problem. I also just wanted to respond here because I see Edwin has put something on about Mediclinic. So just to say, yes, I think Mediclinic is looking to support us. I have not, I'm sorry I didn't put that up yet as a private donation, but I wasn't aware that that arrangement had all been finalized. So we are very much hoping that Mediclinic will support us with this study. And we would be very, very grateful for that support.
Professor Johnny Peter, thank you very much. Hopefully you are as excited as I am about the research. And I've already said to you, there's no such a thing as a free lunch or a webinar. So please, should you want to make a contribution, please do so.
Thanks very much for having me.
Pleasure. Before I sign off, I think I would be remiss if I remain silent on the lockdown and not to offer suggestions as to how we should emerge from this crisis, and it would be irresponsible. We need to get our economy going because ultimately all of our lives depend on it. While we may be a small company, we've got a wide reach and our clients an even wider reach, and we are tuning in to what is happening in the economy, and it is a disaster. So we would like to add our voice to a number of others, one of which is the PSG group, to say that the economy should be opened up. We agree, Mr. President, you and your cabinet should be congratulated with a quick and decisive way in which you've addressed the pandemic. During my lifetime, I've not seen a harder working cabinet. It's great to see your leadership in action. It's great to see that our country can act swiftly and with purpose. And it's great to see the solidarity in our country. But I'm afraid with that ends the good news. The lockdown is causing severe damage to what is left of a fragile economy. And our well-being, our livelihood depends as to whether we can get the economy to recover. Mr. President, the only way to get the economy to recover is to create sustainable jobs. And surprise, surprise, only entrepreneurs and business people can create jobs. And at the moment, we are harming these very people, and they can't make their contribution. And as I'm sure all of you are aware, civil servants are not being laid off. Civil servants, and it's left to be seen whether their salaries will be cut, are in a very cushy position, whereas those that actually fuel the tax income are the ones that have been harmed most. So here with a couple of suggestions. And my wife will say to me, Tace, why do you talk to Mr. President? He's not listening to you. Antoinette, it makes me feel better. And hopefully one or two of the press people that's listening will convey the message. But please stop funding loss-making state-owned enterprises. Close them, liquidate them, get rid of them. Fast-track Eskom's unbundling. And then the most difficult one, decrease the government wage bill. I think Mr. Mboweni already had put that as a target, and unless that's being achieved, we are hiding to nothing. Please do away with minimum wage for 5 years, at least. It crowds out job seekers and it makes it very difficult to compete in labor-intensive industries. And for now, please forget about radical economic transformation. It diverts the attention, it hampers progress, and it enriches a small select group which has been enriched many, many times. Remove the bottlenecks in spectrum allocation, also for independent power producers. Make it easier to do business. Let the mining companies produce electricity. It is stupidity not to do it. While our tax revenue is going to be decimated, be bold and lower the company tax to 20% and provide incentives to manufacturing and finance sectors. And also, please, Mr. President, put the expropriation without compensation narrative to bed. Allocate title deeds to all informal residents on government land. Give them ownership. It will be a massive wealth creator. Government also owns large portions of arable land in South Africa. And currently the farming community is carrying the can for us all. It will be prudent to partner with the large commercial farmers and to utilize the land for food production, both consumption and for export. But Mr. President, most of all, please create a business-friendly or an entrepreneur-friendly business environment. What is that? Mr. President, it's a welcoming environment. It is one that understands that taxes generated by small and medium-sized businesses pay the civil service salary bill, Mr. President, including yours. It's a tax-friendly environment. It's a secure environment with effective policing. It's an environment that's corruption-free, or at least with as little as possible corruption. It absolutely boggles the mind that 3-4 years after we've seen the biggest fraud and corruption cases in South Africa, that no one has been brought to justice. No one has done any jail time. It is well known that state capture costs South Africa, which is already a poor country, and I'd like to repeat that, a poor country, R1 trillion. That's twice the amount that you've allocated for relief. The Steinhoff fraud, the biggest commercial fraud in South Africa ever, cost South Africa 300 billion. Almost also the size of your relief package. And no one has been brought to book. They either live in luxury in Dubai or Hermanus. Mr. President, while you're at it, also get rid of the gangsters in your cabinet. You and they know who they are. I hate to think how they are licking their lips to get their hands on the 500 billion relief package. Mr. President, a business-friendly environment is one that will attract investments that we so desperately need. It is one that will generate growth. And most importantly, it will generate tax income to repay the huge debt bill that's facing us. Lastly, we need to open up the economy ASAP. We are going to see lots of lives that will be lost. But I believe starvation, social unrest, and crime, and a myriad of other chronic diseases is going to damage the economy more. It's time for us to put and work together and try and get this economy going, because ultimately all of our lives depend upon it. My apologies for the rushed nature of my brief criticism and suggestions. I hope that we will see some of these steps being taken, because without them, we are doomed. Then in closing, I would just like to thank my colleagues, the Rootstock team, for having put this together. And I would also like to wish them well, in particular, Johan Barkhuizen, our CEO, and also our Chief Investment Officer, as well as Francois Malan, our Chief Operating Officer, and the entire team. Thank you to you all, and thanks for having done a great job during challenging times and with the way that you have performed. Thanks for attending, stay safe, and goodbye.